you also to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I do need to apologize. I have a cold, so my voice isn't at its best. I just hope it lasts for the whole half hour. So today I'll be talking about ethics guidance that we developed at Springer Nature for research on human population groups. This is guidance that was referenced by some of the speakers yesterday, and I want to provide some background on how it came about, why we put it together, what the aims of the guidance are, and what they are not, what it does not intend to do. Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not a private pursuit. It's a fundamentally social activity. It's embedded in the societies in which it is carried out, and it is also a public good. It is common to all, accessible to all, to benefit from, and that's also a fundamental human right included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The fact that we consider science to be public good is what justifies it being funded by citizens, at least partly, through taxation. Science and scientific knowledge can affect policy and can affect people's lives. The positive examples abound, and there's no reason to enumerate any here. There are also ample negative examples as well. For instance, research of dual use that may be applied to develop weapons of mass destruction, or the legacy of eugenics and the role it played in involuntary sterilization policies in the previous century, and so on. It's because it's a fundamentally social pursuit that science, the scientific endeavor, is also governed by the same principles that govern individual behavior in free democratic societies. Scientists have the right to free inquiry, and that is also codified in the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But at the same time, as with any individual behavior in organized society, it is subject to the harm principle. Scientists need to respect the dignity and rights of the individuals or groups they study, and to prevent harm. These ideas, codified in international human rights treaties, are also underlie research ethics frameworks. There are numerous frameworks. There is a variety of principles, but fundamentally, they all include the requirement to respect the dignity and rights of participants, their biological material, and also the right to the responsibility to minimize harms and maximize potential benefits. This is something that is very well known, certainly to this audience. There are considerations, however, on how do we conceptualize the scope of assessments of benefit and harm, and what sorts of harms and benefits should we be examining. The Belmont report is instructive in this respect. The authors of the report noted that it's not just physical and psychological harm that needs to be considered, but also legal, social, and economic harms, as well as, of course, associated benefits. And with respect to who should we be thinking about when we're considering benefits and harms, it's not just the individual participant and their families, but also society at large, or special groups of people within society. And then the Belmont report notes the problem is to decide when it is justifiable to seek certain benefits despite risks, and when the benefits should be foregone because of the risks. These are the principles, these ethics frameworks underlie the considerations and a review of prospective projects with human participants that research ethics committees undertake. However, the remit of ethics committees is limited to primary data, so data that will be collected for the specific question that the researchers intend to ask. But the research landscape, especially over the last 20 years, has changed substantially. A lot of research does not carry out primary data collection. A lot of research relies on secondary data sets. There are now large-scale administrative data sets available, commercial, digital traces, social platform data, large-scale biobank data, which are collected under broad consent, reuse or repurposing of primary research data, as well as new techniques and methods such as machine learning and AI. But these types of work are not covered, are not within the remit in most jurisdictions of ethics committees. To give you an example of what I have in mind, this is hypothetical, but it is inspired from actual cases that we've dealt with. Let's say that a group of researchers use machine learning that they apply to pre-existing questionnaire data that they link to social media data. And their aim is to develop a method to infer with as high accuracy as possible individual responses to specific questions that some participants who filled in the questionnaires explicitly declined to respond to. These specific questions asked about characteristics that are sensitive and many people prefer not to disclose, such as sexual orientation, mental health, and so on. So this is a type of project that is typically outside the remit of ethics committees and IRBs, but it raises some of the same questions that human participants research raises, in this case, consent. However, this project would not receive ethics review. It would just be received by a journal intended for publication. Some of the harms and considerations of harm, therefore, especially when considering secondary data sets, do not arise prospectively before research is carried out, but they arise when a paper is submitted and intended for publication or communicated. It's these considerations that led us to develop the Springer Nature editorial principles and guidance on content that may be harmful to human population groups. The group was convened by Sir Philip Campbell, then chief editor of Springer Nature, in 2020. Our group consisted of editors, publishers, research integrity experts, legal experts, communications experts. And we worked over 2 years to develop this guidance, which underwent internal and external consultation before being adopted in 2022. We relied a lot on the International Bill of Human Rights and related UN treaties, as well as ethics frameworks for research with human participants. And also we examined and relied upon ethics codes of disciplines such as sociology and anthropology, because these disciplines have considered potential harms in a broader scope, more in depth than other disciplines, as well as related academic research. The guidance consists of 3 main sections: a section outlining principles of scholarly freedom and scholarly responsibility, a section on benefits and harms of research, and a section on research on human populations, which also has 2 subsections, one on race, ethnicity, and racism, and one on sex, gender, and sexual orientation. So the first section recognizes that researchers should be free to ask the research questions they wish and to communicate knowledge without repression or censorship. At the same time, However, there is an ethical obligation to uphold honesty and rational examination of evidence and minimize preventable harms that may arise in the course of research or its communication. When considering benefits and harms of research, we wanted to ensure that the scope covers types of research that are not subsumed under human participants research or research on non-human animals. We relied a lot on the principles of non-maleficence and beneficence, which are fundamental in all research ethics frameworks, and explained that harms can be direct. For instance, they can arise during the conduct of research, causing injury to human participants or unnecessary suffering of non-human animals, compromise of tangible heritage, and so on. But those are not the only harms. Harms can be indirect as a result of the publication of a research project. For instance, stigmatization of a vulnerable group or potential use of the work for unintended purposes. For instance, to undermine human rights or misuse the information to threaten public health. In the section on research on human populations, we specify some requirements for reporting, and we also ask authors to be respectful of the dignity and rights of the human groups they study, to consider the potential implications of their work on the groups they study, if those are defined on the basis of social characteristics, to contextualize their findings in order to minimize as much as is feasible preventable misuse or risks of harm to the populations studied. And finally, to use non-stigmatizing language. The additional subsections on race, ethnicity, and racism, and on sex, gender, and sexual orientation also specify reporting requirements, as well as considerations for research that is or could be perceived to be racist or misogynistic, sexist, anti-LGBTQ+. In submissions, we pay attention to content that may be perceived to undermine the dignity or rights of specific groups or actually does so. Research that assumes that a human group is inherently superior or inferior over another simply because of a social characteristic. Work that may include hate speech or denigrating images, or work that uses potentially stigmatizing language. There has been a lot of discussion of this guidance, and I hope to be able to clarify some of the issues that have come up. And one is whether this guidance intends to suppress socially controversial results. And the answer is no. This guidance is primarily about the assumptions scientists make that are not evidence-based, or how conclusions are drawn based on the presented evidence, or how data drawn from the broader population are used in their studies, but not about the results that scientists obtain in their research. For example, let's look at this group of researchers who examine whether there is an association between workforce gender diversity and business profitability using existing data from a specific country. And let's say that the authors find that there is a negative relationship such that gender diverse businesses are less profitable. The finding may be controversial, but it is what it is, and this is a legitimate research question and a legitimate scientifically obtained answer. This is not what the guidance does not intend to suppress results like this. Another issue that has come up is whether the guidance is about content that might offend. There is a distinction between harm and offense, most clearly drawn in philosophy and in law, not always clearly drawn in everyday conversation, but we draw a distinction between causing harm and giving offense. For something to be harmful, it needs to undermine or violate someone's rights as set out in international human rights treaties. Offense can be caused because something goes against our beliefs, but that's not harmful. So not all content that gives offense is harmful. For example, research on evolution may be offensive for people who believe in intelligent design, but we don't consider the study of evolutionary biology to be harmful to those people who believe in intelligent design. Another question is whether this guidance applies only to historically marginalized groups. And again, the answer is no. It applies to all human groups. All human groups have exactly the same rights and are worthy of exactly the same considerations of harm, regardless of their majority, minority, or any other status. But marginalized or minority groups are more vulnerable to harm, and this is reflected in international human rights treaties with respect to the rights of women, of people with disabilities, the elimination of racial discrimination, and so on. Yesterday, we heard from Bill von Hippel and Ivan Oransky on some of the reasons why research is retracted. Another reason that the Committee on Publication Ethics recommends considering retracting a publication is if it reports unethical research. For example, if it reports an experiment with human participants that did not undergo prospective ethics peer review, or a study reporting results from genetic data that were obtained without consent, and so on. The answer to whether all potentially harmful research in the context of these guidelines, whether there is an ethics reason for rejecting or retracting, is that that's extremely rare. It needs to be unequivocal that the rights of the populations under study have been violated in some way, or that there is clear incitement to discrimination. As with research involving human participants, there's always a consideration of the balance between benefits and harms, and in the vast majority of cases, the benefits outweigh any potential harms. So how can potential harms be minimized? Because a lot of the issues that I've been discussing arise with research that is exempt from ethics review. We recruit, if necessary, ethicists or bioethicists or other research ethics experts to participate in the peer review process. We also advise authors to be careful in reporting research findings, which the same principle and encouragement applies for any research project, but it is even more important in these contexts to be precise in definitions of terms and concepts, to stay close to what the evidence actually shows, and to also be transparent about limitations. We publish a companion commentary that places the research in context and discusses controversial issues. We may publish an editorial that also provides context, and we will draft careful press releases that aim to place the research in the context, in its broader context, discuss limitations, and prevent, as much as is possible, misinterpretation. To give you an example, this is a paper we published a few years ago. The paper asks the question the authors are addressing here is why does same-sex sexual behavior persist through evolutionary history, given that it does not seem to have an obvious fitness or survival benefit. What the authors found was that among people who only have sex with people of the opposite sex, variants, alleles associated with same-sex sexual behavior are associated with having more partners, more sexual partners, and that confers a mating advantage. The authors were very careful in presenting their work. They were very precise. They were very transparent about the limitations. They also wrote frequently an FAQ to accompany the publication of their paper. It was written in lay terms so that any reader could understand. We also published two accompanying commentaries that addressed ethics issues associated with this type of work. One addressed the question that some people have as to whether this type of research should be carried out, given that it is subject to very broad abuse in social abuse. The other addressed questions as to whether the data provided in the context of biobanks, whether there are limitations and considerations with respect to consent for follow-on projects that may not be necessarily related to health. And we also wrote an editorial. The editorial presented the editorial process as well as our ethics considerations. So in sum, the social character of science, I have argued, requires consideration and assessment of potential benefits and harms, as well as care in how scientific results are communicated. There may be cases where it is warranted to reject or retract a project, and the guidelines do specify that, but those are very rare, and there needs to be unequivocal evidence that there is a violation of the rights of the population studied, or a clear and ambiguous incitement to discrimination. It's important that ethics frameworks evolve to encompass new forms of research. This is happening, for instance, in the context of the Declaration of Helsinki, with the accompanying declaration, Type A declaration, that deals with biobank data and data that I have discussed, secondary data. And finally, journals and publishers, we should be transparent as to how we deal with ethics concerns around harm in the manuscripts that we handle and publish. Thank you for your attention.
We have a few minutes of Q&A.
Hello, I'm Jesse Single. I'm a journalist. First of all, thank you for talking to this conference. I think you have a different view than a lot of people here, and it's incredibly valuable to have your voice. You had said that a paper that showed gender diverse companies perform worse would not run afoul of your guidelines. One of the guidelines is, I'm reading directly, content that undermines or could reasonably be perceived to undermine the rights and dignities of an individual or human group on the basis of socially constructed or socially relevant human groupings. If you had evidence that female participation in male-dominated industries cause those companies to perform worse, couldn't that undermine the rights and dignities of women seeking to break into those industries?
I think the operative word here is cause. You used the word cause. I didn't, and I would ask the authors not to use the word cause. The cause is not because women or any other gender group. This is an observation, whether it is something specific about women, whether it is something about the way women and men interact, whether then follow-on research should provide evidence to support a claim that there is some specific characteristic or a collection of characteristics or a collection of evidence explains the association. But the study I've presented is a study of association. That's really important, and we ask researchers to be very careful. If their data do not allow causal inference, then the cause should not be assumed.
I think my critique here, which you've probably heard, is that these are just very general guidelines open to wide interpretation. So content that undermines the rights and dignities, a mere association could undermine the rights and dignities. I'll leave it at that, but.
I don't believe that evidence of association, when properly presented, undermines dignity and rights. I don't believe that causal evidence does so either. But any scientific project needs to stay very close to the data, the evidence it has, and what it can support.
Well, hopefully get a couple more questions in here. Off to this side.
So I was thinking about a situation where you could have conflicting claims of harm in a single study. An example that comes to mind is in criminology. PNAS retracted a study on showing no support for racial bias in policing. And this was in the post-George Floyd era, and a bunch of scholars demanded its retraction because of the harm, and it was already used in congressional hearings and such, of toning down the defunding of the police, and it was considered harmful for vulnerable populations in effort to address this apparently real problem of racial bias in policing. So that was a harm argument that this, but then we also know, I would say more solid research, that the type of deep research and rhetoric around and defunding the police and the advocating for these policies has actually harmed minority communities. Depolicing has had negative impact on homicide and lack of law enforcement in motor vehicle accidents. So Black people have actually suffered from these programs. So you could have same study, have a very, and we have a field that obviously is dominated by these luxury beliefs that, that signal their, support for these defunding type of ideas, but do not actually care about. So we have a situation where the dominant harm narrative is of the first kind, but there's a very strong opposite claim about harms about the single study. So how do you litigate against these conflicting claims?
I can't speak to the specific paper simply because of insufficient familiarity, but a lot of the research happening in the social science, a lot of the research Nature Human Behavior publishes is research where there is a lot of complexity, and the considerations of harm are multiple, complex, perhaps conflicting. Our purpose is not to resolve those. Our purpose is to provide a platform in the same way as the genetics paper I presented, where there are conflicting. Some people believe this research shouldn't happen, others believe that it should, and there are different arguments from different ethics points of view why it should or should not happen. Such research is important to contextualize, so not to publish a paper alone, but to frame it with accompanying commentary that provides different perspectives. When topics are actively debated in society, any single research paper cannot resolve them, cannot provide an answer. So framing, providing a forum for discussion within the journal at the time of publication provides more context and can also be utilized in the public sphere in a much more responsible way.
Okay, so thank you for your many questions. Sam, there's a young woman in black here down the middle, has had her hand up for a long time. I don't know if we can do too many more questions. I'll leave it to Anna to decide.
Thank you so much. Julia Shaletsky from UC Berkeley. I try to be brief. My question is, I mean, the wider social harms thing, I think brushes many people the wrong way because it's so abstract and it's so arbitrary. I mean, you clearly spent 3 years now looking at all the standards, thinking deeply about it. But in the end, we have editors that are overworked, very quickly have to make a decision. Often the decision will be wrong. The thing that bothers me about it is two things. First of all, we assume we kind of minimize the agency of the communities we actually talk about because we assume we know what's best for them. So that's an oddly paternalistic attitude, you know, that has harmed people in the past in many ways. But the other element is also sometimes we prevent long-term good outcomes by focusing on short-term harms. So I give you a concrete example. For example, in San Francisco, monkeypox spread. I work in epidemiology a bit, and it was completely politically incorrect to talk about the populations that were affected because of fear of stigmatization, and that has led to more infections and more morbidity around monkeypox in the long run. But the California Public Health Department was really concerned about these indirect effects of stigmatization, basically putting sexual promiscuity out there in context of a community. But that harmed people because then more people were infected with a disease that couldn't be cured really at the time. So this is what I struggle with, this whole approach of focusing not only on direct harms of participants, which is fully valid, but also focusing on somewhat nebulous harms for the community, while at the same time, you know, not knowing things about you that are true or about your community that are true could also harm you in long-term ways because you can't really fix them in any way or address the issues.
Thank you. That's a very important question, and that's one that's it's really very central on our minds when we editorial minds when we make considerations about work that raises potentially ethics questions. It's really important for our decisions to be transparent. So whatever decision we make needs the rationale needs to be apparent to the authors so that we can be held accountable. Our effort, the reason why we developed these guidelines is so that the criteria that we work with are not nebulous, and that political correctness is not the reason why any paper should be rejected. Attending to using non-stigmatizing language is a copy editing level change that's important, but it's not something that would ever lead to rejection of papers. We do focus on fundamental human rights and values, and cases where there is explicit incitement to discriminate by saying that group with cultural values X should not be allowed to live in a free society. That's a paraphrase of a claim that has been made in the recent scientific literature. It does go against the human rights, but it has to be as extreme as that for something to be rejected. So the considerations that I think matter are sensitizing scientists to the fact that scientific knowledge is extremely powerful in people's lives, and to consider as much as possible what consequences the research might have, so attempting to minimize harms. The aim is not to suppress research projects because they are controversial, and definitely not to stop having discussions around topics where there are societal divisions or differences.